In our Perspective bonus series, we sit with the edges of addiction, the often unseen ripple effects on the people who love the addict most, and the deeper soul wounds that keep someone stuck even years into recovery. Today, we go straight into one of the most hidden and devastating of those wounds: moral injury. Now, moral injury is not the same as PTSD. It is a deep fracture that occurs when someone violates their own core values or witnesses something that shatters their moral framework. It shows up as profound shame, isolation, and a sense that the self is broken beyond repair. It often fuels addiction, destroys families, and lingers in faith communities long after the substances are gone. I brought on Larry Brant because his work as a Navy chaplain, combat veteran, and author of Restoring the Broken gives us a clear, faith-rooted map for understanding this wound and walking the path of genuine restoration. His framework aligns closely with the Restore Step of S.O.B.E.R method and offers language and hope for anyone carrying these invisible fractures. A reminder that your flavor of confidence is the unique, authentic inner strength built through the S.O.B.E.R cycle. And today, we explore how restoration after moral injury is part of building that layered confidence. Please welcome Dr. Larry Brant.
Thank you. Nice to be on today. It's a privilege to be here.
I'm really happy to have you. And we had a really nice conversation before we got started. So I'm excited to continue it.
Yeah.
So, Larry, for listeners who may be new to the term, can you walk us through what moral injury actually is and how it differs from PTSD? In other words, how does this deep soul wound show up in the world of addiction recovery, especially through the shame, the isolation, and the sense that one's identity might be permanently broken?
Yeah. You gave a pretty good definition there at the beginning, where you were saying that moral injury. I kind of look at it as kind of PTSD's evil twin, because quite often a person with moral injury may often have PTSD as well. And we know that PTSD is that fear-based trauma, where it was a trauma from some type of event and it could be one event or it could be a cascading series of events that just traumatize that individual to where they are just on hyper vigilance all of the time, waiting for the next thing to drop, not confident in their own ability to be able to handle what comes their way because of how traumatized they are. And moral injury comes, like you said, is when a person does something quite often under the orders of someone who is in authority over them, or they may choose not to intervene in something. And then the end result is just something that goes against everything that they believe morally, ethically, emotionally, and especially spiritually, to the point that the person just absolutely becomes consumed with guilt and shame. That guilt and shame causes the person to isolate themselves from actually everything that could actually help them. It isolates them from their faith, it isolates them from their family, and it isolates them from their friends, because they pull back from all of those things, really for two reasons. Number one, they pull back from them because they're afraid that people in those three areas might see them as a monster. And secondly, they pull back from these three areas because they feel like they have been corrupted by what has happened, by these morally injurious events. They feel like these events and their decisions in these events have actually corrupted them. And they're afraid the closer they get to others, the more they could potentially corrupt others. That's kind of like a 1-2 punch, the fear of being seen as something very ugly and evil, but also the fear of corrupting others and just feeling like their soul is shattered. So they withdraw and then further go down that isolating hole of loneliness, numbness, addiction, and it's just a perpetuating cycle.
It's just a horrible thing to watch. But you've walked this territory yourself in combat deployments in Afghanistan and then years of ministry with first responders and families. Could you share how moral injury showed up in your own life or in the lives of those that you have helped serve, and what personal experience taught you about the authority that comes from carrying the wound yourself?
Yeah, now for me, I'm not so much moral injury, but I am most definitely PTSD. Uh,
Understood.
you know, as we discussed, I joined the Navy when I was 45. I felt a call from God to leave my church there in Lincoln, Nebraska, where you are, and joined the Navy at 45. My wife likes to joke that we're currently living my midlife crisis. She will tell people we couldn't afford a convertible. He didn't want to be trained by a new wife, so he asked to run off and join the Navy. And I said, sure. Ah, and so that's the life we've been living. But I joined in 2009, and by August of 2011, I was on my first deployment. And I'm sorry, by August of 2010. And then by January of 2011, I was in a combat zone with a Marine infantry battalion. And in March of 2011, I was in my very first firefight where people were actually shooting at me versus just around me. And my assistant, when a chaplain deploys to a combat zone, actually, when a chaplain goes anywhere in the Navy, we have an assistant called a religious program specialist, or RP for short. And what they do really three things. They help us with our administration, because let's be honest, ministers really usually stink at admin, and chaplains are no different. Secondly, they help rig the various religious services that we have, because we'll have services that we do, services by guest chaplains from other denominations, or we'll have lay leader representatives from different faith groups. And the RP makes sure that all of those services get set up correctly to help guarantee the First Amendment rights of our service members. And then, thirdly, in a combat zone, the RP is the chaplain's bodyguard, because when I walk onto the battlefield, I had no weapon of any kind, but he does. And he saved my life that day. And literally grabbed me by my plate carrier, spun me around, and threw me under an MRAP just as a burst of gunfire landed where I was previously standing.
Wow. Did he survive?
Yes, he did.
Good.
He did. He survived, and he's currently still in the Navy and serving in Guam as a
Oh,
religious program specialist.
that,
Uh,
that that's great.
yeah. Um, But as we continued working with people, really my experience with PTSD and moral injury could even go back a little bit as I was working with first responders right there in Lincoln, Nebraska. Because situations can happen whether you're a paramedic, whether you're a firefighter, whether you're a police officer, and because of the nature of your position, have to engage in something and the outcome isn't what you were hoping. Then they begin being filled with guilt and shame and second guessing their ability. And that starts to undermine what they are trying to do. And then they lose confidence in their ability. Or sometimes a decision made by someone above them that they don't disagree with, but they have to obey it anyway. And then the outcome is something that just goes against everything they believe. Now, from that first combat experience, I'm still talking with Marines and sailors who were involved in that combat experience years later that are still struggling, even though they took the lives of insurgents who were trying to kill them. They are still struggling with knowing that they ended a life. Working with them, sometimes over FaceTime, sometimes over the phone, or sometimes as we meet face to face from time to time, helping them through that. And then going on is 16, 17 years of counseling Marines, sailors, and Coast Guardsmen, because Navy chaplains also work with the Coast Guard, working with them in those, let's just be honest, messy ethical situations, helping them to see that even though you may have moral injury and PTSD, that doesn't mean that you have to stay broken.
How quickly does that appear in someone? I mean, is it hidden at first? In other words, Do they start to feel like something's a little off, but they don't know what's wrong with them, and they start to immediately pull back and disconnect before they recognize that I need help with this? I mean, how does that present normally?
Normally, that's here's the crazy thing, it's individualistic in that in some people, it can appear almost immediately because they may feel betrayed by their institution or by their leadership or by their own decision making. And so that may happen almost, but especially what we see in a lot of veterans is maybe a decade, 2 decades later, they begin to reflect on their experiences. And that's when a case of moral injury may set in. I was working with a gentleman who had been 20 years retired from the Marine Corps, but he had begun reflecting on everything he had done on those deployments and what he'd been ordered to do. Uh, and, you know, one comment he said to me, and he has said it to others, so I'm free to share it, is that they gave me a medal for killing someone. And with that, he had distanced himself from his wife, from his children, for that, like what I was talking earlier, he was afraid of corrupting them. And God bless his wife, she stuck it out with him. And he would come to work and he would just be haunched over. He would eat constantly because he was just eating his anxiety. And he would talk more in grunts than he would actually use words. Which is a typical Marine thing anyway, let's just be honest, you go to a Marine, "How you doing, Marine?" "Er, yeah, rah," that's normal language for Marines, but even more so for this gentleman. And as he joined a group that we had here on base and began really working through his issues because we do an 8-week course that actually began with the VA. And quite frankly, with their permission, I ripped it off and kind of tweaked it for active duty called Building Spiritual Strength. And we started going through that and we look at several different topics, such as why is God allow evil in the world? How do you forgive others? How do you forgive yourself? And topics such as that help the individual either reconnect to their faith, maybe connect to a new faith, or connect to something that's bigger than themselves. The cool thing that happened with this individual was he took the notebook or the workbook that we give him because I'm a guy who assigns homework. You don't just talk to me and then walk out of the room. I'm going to say, before the next time we talk, here's what you need to do. He actually took the workbook we gave him and took it to his VA counselor. And his VA counselor, I wish I knew her name because she's a brilliant individual. She adjusted her counseling so that it complemented what we were doing in the group for those 8 weeks, which is wonderful. And the transformation we saw in him, he went from somebody who grunted pretty much most of the time. Then in the 8th week that we had, he informed the class, he said, I've made a decision. I have decided to tell my wife what I've been hiding all these years. The group and myself, because I lead the group with a mental health professional, that way they hear the clinical as well as the spiritual. So we all huddled around him. We prayed for him. We hugged on him. And then I saw him a few months later, and I could hardly believe the transformation in him. He walked upright, and this is a tall fella. He's like 6'6". Yeah. When he walked upright, he had dropped about 50 pounds because he was no longer eating his anxiety, and he was smiling. He was smiling and laughing, and I saw him and I said, "So what happened?" And he said, "I sat down with my wife and I told her everything I was afraid to tell her." And her reply was, "I've been waiting for this." And she did not see him as a monster. And she hugged on him and said, "I'm here with you for the long haul. I love you." And some of his coworkers have even come to me and said, "What did you do to him? He's now cracking jokes in the office."
Oh,
but
amazing.
but yet at the same time, these folks who suffer from this, they don't believe that that's possible. That's why they isolate themselves. And that's why I try to get success stories like this out there for them to see that there is a path back to restoration that closely aligns with your soberment.
Well, I have one question in all of that is that you're talking about the separation of identity, basically, in that you have an identity that is tied to these things that what happens in the mind when it's quiet, basically. So the people that years later are reflecting back on things that happen, and it separates from who they truly are. And then they start labeling themselves as broken. But what I'm curious is, how do you work to map that, and what's that move forward? I mean, I know it's individualized, but do you think there's anything generally that works to help find that path forward for someone?
Well, yeah. Um, I think one of the very first things that has to happen is that whether it's a person or whether it's a group, they need to have a safe place to tell their story. Because what I have noticed, and I think has been well documented, is that these individuals isolate themselves and continue to tell themselves a self perpetuating story that spins them as the bad guy. And just as you said, they lose their identity. Their identity goes from where it was previously to I'm now a horrible, terrible person who couldn't possibly be loved or forgiven by my friends, my family, or even God. And that opening step of having a safe place to tell their story and realizing that they may not be the only one who's struggling like this, then that helps them to kind of open themselves to investigating and being willing to walk a path toward restoration.
Yeah. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, you've taken everything that you've learned and brought together and put a book out. Your book is Restoring the Broken. And my understanding, I haven't read it yet, so full disclosure there, but it lays out a practical framework for ministry leaders. Can you explain what your book does for those leaders?
I'd be happy to. So one thing that I have noticed as I've been going around, as I've been stationed in different locations, and in every location I go to, we join a local congregation. Because just I'm a chaplain doesn't mean I don't need to be spiritually fed. One thing I've been privileged to be is quite often when I join a congregation, the pastor sees me as somebody that they can kind of quite frankly, confide in without being judged because before being a chaplain, I had that 25 years of local church experience. What I have noticed is that many pastors have a relatively good handle on what PTSD is, but very, very few of them understand what moral injury is and how it's different from PTSD and how what companioning somebody with moral injury is different than PTSD. So as I was looking at that, as I was talking to pastors and even civilian chaplains, I would sit down with them and I would say, okay, tell me what PTSD is. And they would say, oh, no problem. PTSD is da 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 da. And they'd have a pretty good definition of it. Then I would look them in the eye and I would say, okay, now tell me what moral injury is. And they would be like a deer in headlights. It would be like, that's a term that I just really don't know. So then I would explain moral injury. And it would be amazing. On almost every single instance, they would say, that explains him or that explains her. They could immediately think of someone in their congregation that totally describes that they haven't been able to connect with. What I did for Restoring the Broken was I took my doctoral research and tried to pull all of the academic language out of it and just make it a pretty straightforward book to help those ministry leaders, or maybe even just family members or even individuals with moral injury themselves. Just a straightforward definition of what it is and how the church needs to really step up and help those individuals and laid out a framework to do that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's fantastic. So, for someone listening right now, whether they're in recovery or wrestling with the shame of things they did while using, if we apply this onward to addiction, and obviously addiction touches a lot of this at times, what's one perspective shift or small daily practice you wish someone had told them earlier on in the process?
I would encourage them to do a two-way prayer log. And I don't know if that's something you've ever heard of before. It's done sometimes in therapy, but this one has a different twist on it. To do a daily prayer journal, or if they practice meditation, do a daily meditation journal. But then write down how they're feeling, the experiences of the day, what a journal is normally for. But then, how would God answer them back? Just sit down. Okay, here's how I'm feeling. Here's what happened. Maybe here's where I lost my identity. Here's why I fell back onto my drug of choice or drink of choice. And then write down how they think God would answer them back.
That's powerful. I mean, you're stepping into both sides of the equation. You're thinking about who you are and what is going on yourself, and then how God would answer you. And that requires a lot of reflection in the process, right? Because you're not just unloading and unbearing yourself from the challenges you're facing, but you're allowing yourself a tiny bit of grace by putting yourself in God's view of things. And I can see where that would really help.
Yeah, it helps the individual. So much when somebody is in the throes of addiction, all they're all they can focus on is themselves. And sometimes they're focused on their pain and how they can numb it. They're using that addiction to numb that. And what we have seen with the two-way prayer journal is for many, it helps them begin to take a look at themselves, but not just through their eyes. How
Yeah.
how does how does God see them? How may their loved ones see them? And to kind of help them get that 10,000-foot view rather than being just so focused on the pain. One thing that I had the privilege of doing when I went through, the Navy sent me through clinical pastoral education, which is something that you have to do in order to qualify to work in a hospital. I did a 6-month residency at Naval Hospital San Diego, and I did a 6-month residency with the VA. And the VA sent me to a PTSD domiciliary that they have in San Diego called the S.O.B.E.R Center. What the S.O.B.E.R Center does, and it's absolutely amazing. I wish the VA, hint, hint, VA people who are listening, I wish the VA would replicate this in other places. But they took homeless veterans off the streets of San Diego diagnosed with PTSD. They would house them for 6 months in the S.O.B.E.R Center, and then they would begin to help them get clean, and then addressing their PTSD and moral injury and other issues, use that to help them to stay clean. And then they help them find jobs and housing so that they don't go right back out onto the street. And they've got about an 85% success rate, which is huge.
Yeah, that's awesome. I wasn't aware of that program, and I've been in that hospital in San Diego before because, as I mentioned, my father was in the Navy.
Right.
So, yeah,
The
that's
program, the Aspire Center is actually in Old Town. If
okay.
you're
Hmm.
And what they did was they actually took over an old law office building and turned it into this PTSD domiciliary. And it's just amazing to be able to see the transition when they begin to see what PTSD and moral injury is doing to them and how they have been, quite frankly, just stopping and numbing their pain and their feelings and using addiction to do that, but not progressing any at all. But then as we were working with them to see them pivot from addiction to the only way through this swamp is by going through the middle and getting neck deep in the mud before I actually get better.
Well, Larry, thank you for sharing so openly and honestly with us today. For everyone listening, here's one perspective I want you to carry with you this month, inspired by Dr. Brant's work. Moral injury doesn't have to be the end of your story. It is the place where the real work of restoration actually begins, where we stop hiding the shame, We name the fracture honestly, and we choose to rebuild with grace, one accountability step at a time. And that's exactly what the restore step in Sober is built for. Now, Larry, we have a tradition on this series where each guest leaves a question for my next perspectives guest. Jennifer Chase left you this question: what do you do when the dark moments return?
What I do when the dark moments return, I do a differentiation exercise, is what I do. I say a quick prayer, and then I take a look at the situation that has caused my dark moment, and I say, what is the same than what has happened to me previously? How is this situation different? And then I focus on those differences to keep me grounded and to keep me from flashing back to those situations. Because, my PTSD is severe enough that I have had flashbacks. Uh,
Wow. Well, that sounds like a really cool method. Huh. I'm definitely going to jot that one down after we wrap up here.
well, good. I'm glad I was helpful to you.
Hey, so what's one question you'd like to leave for the next person who comes on the show?
For the next person who comes on the show, I would say to them, what is next for you?
Hmm. Okay, that'll be a good open ended one. I can't wait to hear the answer. Larry, the floor is yours for the final minute. Is there any wisdom or hope for listeners who feel like they're carrying the weight of moral injury, shame, or the ripples of addiction?
I would just say you don't have to stay where you are. There is a path of hope and restoration. And in that path of hope and restoration, it can lead you to actually bloom where you are currently planted.
Wow, that's a really powerful one. I love it. Bloom where you're currently planted. Excellent. To everyone listening, you're not alone in this. The wounds may run deep, but so does the path to restoration. I'm Massimo Rigatti. This is the Sober Method Podcast. Please follow, like, subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who really needs it. Remember, everyone, your future is sober.